Day, May Day or International Workers' Day was not a day to be missed. It used to pull crowds and so on, but nowadays that seems not to be the case. What would you say is the issue here, the bone of contention?
Thank you very much. In the older days, if we look at the beginning of May Day in Namibia in the late 1980s, there was a combination of political issues, the struggle for independence in which unions were actively engaged in, and combining that with labor issues, the question of discrimination at work, the low wages, bad working conditions. And workers saw the struggle for independence as also a struggle to bring about decent work for all, to bring about a living wage. And that's why it was quite easy at the time that we had rallies with tens of thousands of workers attending May Day. After independence, there was then this expectation that somehow things would fall into place almost automatically. May Day rallies were increasingly addressed by government officials, not by workers and worker leaders anymore. And over time, May Day seemed to have become almost a public holiday like anyone else. It lost a bit that special meaning, and it lost a bit the workers' drive to shape that day. But it's also, of course, it was accompanied by changes in the structures of the economy in terms of workers feeling still marginalized, a huge power imbalance between employers and workers then feeling that even their own organization, the trade unions, were not always effective in protecting them and in advancing a working class agenda that's based on their specific interests and their struggle for a living wage and work for all. And I think this combination of a disillusionment with some of the trade unions and a kind of sliding towards accepting Workers' Day as just another public holiday contributed to the low turnout. But it's definitely a worrying trend for our trade unions.
Now, speaking of trade unions, Mr. Jauch, during the heydays, they used to be known as these respected associations and the leaders would be listened to. But after your explanation and also the observation, trade unions have weakened, or their influence weakened to a certain extent. Does that mean that their attentions have been diverted and now they are only fighting for survival?
When we talk of trade unions today, we must look at this general picture we have in Namibia, namely that we have about 40 registered trade unions. They are grouped into 3 union federations. They often work rather almost against each other rather than with each other. And so it left workers in a divided scenario and in a state of where they feel they can't really shape policies in their favor. At the workplace, we've also seen how the fights amongst trade unions has weakened their positions, how employers have used that opportunity to play out workers against each other. And it has left workers divided and severely weakened. And this is what plays into the current crisis. And we must also see that coupled to the broader economic crisis that happens in the country, and that's not just since COVID, that already long before COVID we had massive levels of unemployment. Always over 30% of Namibian workers were unemployed. Many were casually employed, informally employed. And the Human Development Report of Namibia of 2020 found that the vast majority of workers earned actually less than 1,500 per month. Now, these are very serious crises, and trade unions need to really pool resources and also find ways of reaching workers in those various sectors, not just the traditional sectors like public service, mining and fishing, but also those that are in smaller workplaces and those in the informal economy. These are all workers that need trade unions that are strong and can give them a voice through which they can not only raise the issue, but through which they can make changes. And that also requires an intervention in the policy arena. And I think in that area particularly, trade unions have been rather weak in the past years.
So how then can they rescue themselves?
Excuse me? I couldn't catch.
How then can the trade unions reclaim their former glory
I would
of
say
being
two things.
influential?
Number one is to organize across the political divide. We've had historically a recent scenario where trade unions were divided along political lines. They broke each other, started new unions or new federations even, and divided themselves. That's the one issue, to say we represent workers of all persuasions and we represent also broader working class interests. Secondly, unions need to find ways of making themselves attractive to young workers, because you cannot just rely on your old struggle comrades of yesteryear. You need to be an organization that attracts young people into unions at various workplaces. And thirdly, unions need to articulate positions and fight for policies that will really have a meaningful impact on young people and young workers in general. And that's not just at the workplace. That means tackling issues like universal health care for all, quality education for all, decent housing for all. These are issues that affect workers across the country, and trade unions have not been very vocal on those issues. And I think these three areas are what unions need to look at: building that unity and becoming a force that is able to influence development in the country, not just wages and conditions of employment narrowly at one or two workplaces, but looking at the country generally, and how do we bring about a redistributive agenda that benefits workers in Namibia generally. That should be the question, in my view, that unions need to ask themselves today.
Well, Mr. Jauch, just before I let you go, there are also incidences in this country whereby some workers are left alone to state or fight their cases at the Labour Commissioner's office against giants.
Absolutely. And this shows the power imbalance. When individual workers have to approach the office of the Labour Commissioner, they are largely unprotected. And in addition, they are faced with an office that seems to be understaffed and undercapacitated, and where cases are not resolved quickly within 30 days as envisaged, but they drag on for months. So what it means for workers is to do two things. Number one, organize themselves, and that means in the form of a trade union that speaks with a united voice for all of them. And number two, push the Ministry of Labour and government in general to beef up this dispute resolution system so that disputes, as promised, can be resolved speedily and effectively, because for many workers it truly is a scenario of justice delayed is justice denied. And workers need access to justice and to fairness through the Office of the Labour Commissioner.